On a calm summer afternoon on the 7th of February 1863, the western coastline of New Zealand looked deceptively peaceful. The light sea rolled gently towards the Manukau heads. The sky was clear, the wind was light. There was no storm, no warning, and no visible danger. And yet, within a matter of hours, well over 100 men would be dead. This is the story of HMS Orpheus. Orpheus was then a modern warship of the British Royal Navy, and this disaster is still notorious for being the worst maritime disaster in New Zealand's history. The Orpheus was a Jason-class corvette with 21 guns. She was launched at Chatham Dockyards in Kent on the 23rd of June 1860, her keel having been laid 2 years before. Orpheus weighed over 2,000 tons. She was 225 feet long, had a width of 40 feet, and had a top speed by steam of 12 knots. These Jason-class corvettes were designed for speed, endurance, and most of all, global service. And they fell squarely within the transition period between sail and steam-powered propulsion. It was essential that they had both. They still needed both because during this time it could not be guaranteed that coal would always be available in the different remotely located ports around the world that these vessels could now travel to, so sails were still very much required. Unfortunately, this meant that more crew were required on board, as you now needed people skilled with steam engines and people who were still skilled with rigging. At the time of this tragedy, 259 souls were on board, and most of these were crew members with the average age being just 25. Sadly, it was not unusual at the time to have children as young as 12 on board, learning the ropes, as they say. And tragically, many of these children were lost during this disaster. At the time of this voyage, Orpheus was serving as the flagship of the Australian station. Now, the Australian station was not just a single place, but it was an operational area that covered Oceania and Antarctica. As flagship, Orpheus was tasked with safeguarding British shipping lanes, deterring piracy, and ensuring the security of trade routes vital to colonial commerce between Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. On the 31st of January 1863, the Orpheus left Sydney Harbour bound for Auckland with naval stores, dispatches, and mail for the Royal Navy's New Zealand operations. Amongst the 259 personnel on board was Commodore William John Samuel Burnett as senior officer and Captain James Burns in command. The Orpheus was set to relieve HMS Miranda, and it was to remain in New Zealand as flagship of the Australian station's New Zealand division. At this time there was a vicious war going on in New Zealand between some Maori tribes, otherwise known as iwi, and government forces, which included British and colonial troops and some Maori allies, otherwise known as kupapa. The 7-day sailing across the Tasman was pretty uneventful, and the Orpheus sighted land off the Manukau harbour entrance around 11 a.m. on the 7th of February 1863. The conditions were fine and the weather was clear. There was a slight moderate southwesterly breeze and very good visibility. The sandbar off the Manukau harbour entrance had a notorious reputation, and like any treacherous waterway at the time, there had been a pilot station set up so that local pilots with expert knowledge of a particular hazard could board any approaching ship and guide them safely into harbour. The Orpheus did signal to the Paratutai pilot station, but at that time there was not one standardised code, so the messages were misunderstood and no pilot was sent. The time was now 1 p.m. and the Orpheus was positioned about 1 mile from the harbour entrance. After a long frustrating wait with no pilot appearing, Commodore Burnett ordered the steam to be raised so that the ship had more power if needed to cross the treacherous bar. During the wait for a pilot, a southwesterly wind had sprung up and the waves were slowly growing stronger. A longer wait could have caused even more problems, so the Orpheus started heading towards the harbour entrance. Then something very unusual occurred, and this is where we shall fall into the eyes of a sailor. His name was Frederick Butler, and he had deserted his ship in Sydney, had been arrested and was being returned to New Zealand in disgrace in the ship's brig, which was like a small prison cell. Suddenly Frederick noticed from his porthole that the ship he was imprisoned in was not on the correct course to enter harbour safely. He was familiar with this harbour, as he had been quartermaster in HMS Harrier and had crossed the bar at the harbour entrance on 2 previous occasions. Just imagine this man's fear. He was the only person on this ship who knew the danger everybody was in, but he was stuck in a prison cell. In a panic, he called out at the top of his voice, "Danger, danger." At first he was ignored, but then finally somebody took note and heard his pleas. He was taken to the Commodore on the bridge, and he told him frantically that Orpheus should be steering a course more northerly to cross the bar safely and enter the main channel. The Commodore could not believe what he was hearing, and he frantically showed Frederick the chart. Frederick cried out, "It is the wrong chart," again pointing to where the main channel lay. Just imagine the terror at this point. Frederick knew what was coming. Unbelievably, the Orpheus had not been provided with the latest charts that showed how the sandbar had moved over the years, and all they had available was an out-of-date old chart which was mapped many years before. Commodore Burnett ordered the helm to be put hard to starboard and the engines reversed. But it was too late, and at 1:30 she struck the shoal, ploughed a short distance and then struck again with a heavy jolt that shook the whole ship. The ship then swung around and went broadside, so it was side on to the waves. A southwesterly wind had sprung up and the waves were growing stronger. The whole side of the ship was now being heavily pounded by the breaking waves, which were only growing with intensity as the day passed by. These intensifying breakers washed right over the deck and washed 2 small boats, a cutter and a jolly boat, right off the deck and into the sea. The powerful waves began forcing hatch covers open, which allowed water to start swamping the hold. The crew desperately started to try and move anything heavy that they could manage overboard in a vain attempt to lighten the ship. The remaining cutter was launched from the Orpheus. It was to be fully crewed, with the paymaster and secretary being ordered to take the private signals, the public records and the ship's books to shore, and then to come back and help save more men. This cutter had a really difficult time of it, and was swamped on several occasions, even losing 5 men overboard, but it eventually broke loose from the worst of the waves. The Commodore then ordered the pinnace, which was a small tender boat, to be launched to go to shore and to get help. It was about this time that a steamer called the Wonga Wonga was heading out of the Manukau harbour. The pinnace and cutter, whilst rowing away, came together and they tried to get the attention of the crew on the Wonga Wonga. After some delay, the Wonga Wonga steamer headed towards them and picked the occupants up. It then headed to the stricken Orpheus with the pinnace and cutter in tow. At this point, the pilot, Mr. Wing, who had been on shore all of this time, had also seen what was happening, and he, along with 4 young Maori men, rowed out to assist in the rescue. As they waited for help, the crew, who were still on board the Orpheus, desperately continued battling to secure openings and jettison any stores or anchors and cannons that they could, but this proved futile as the flooding destabilized the ship. Finally, the rescuers reached the stricken vessel at around 6 p.m. At that time, she was lying over to port and the masts were still standing. Most of the men had climbed up into the rigging to escape from the terrifying waves that were washing across the decks. They had to cut away the sails as it was impossible to furl them. The Wonga Wonga was not able to get close enough to the wreck for fear of hitting the sandbar themselves, so the smaller boats were used. Unfortunately, these smaller rescue boats were still only able to get about 30 or 40 meters away from the wreck, and the rescuers tried to persuade the men to jump for it. but the waves at this time were fierce and the chances of survival were small. As a result, only a few brave men jumped, and some did make it, but others who jumped did not. What a desperate choice to have to make. As the day passed by, the swell got even larger and the rescue operation became even more treacherous. The rescuers desperately pleaded with the men who were clinging onto the rigging to jump for it, but they must have been frozen by fear and were unable to make that choice. So the rescuers took themselves and anyone who they had saved over to the steamer for refuge. The Wonga Wonga was situated about 3/4 of a mile away from the wreck, safely away from the sandbanks. At around 8:30 p.m. there was an almighty bang, and the Orpheus main mast was seen collapsing into the sea. Many of their friends were on their masts, and it was too much for the rescuers, so they bravely went to try and save anybody who they could from the water. Unfortunately, just about every soul who were taking refuge up that mast were tragically lost. When the main mast fell, it smashed right through the deck, and this accelerated the massive structural failure of the wooden framing, which was never designed for such brutal forces, and the whole ship began tearing apart. This caused the remaining heavy guns to be knocked from their carriages, and they crashed into the ship's sides, which only added to the ship's structural failure. At this point all was lost, and the bow and stern were being slowly torn apart. And by nightfall that is exactly what happened. The forward and aft masts and everybody clinging onto them were cast into the crashing waves. A few very lucky men were able to cling onto floating wreckage, and they were picked up by the pinnace on its final rescue attempt. Unfortunately, they really did only number but a few. As night fell, the rescuers watched from a distance on the Wonga Wonga, but there was nothing else that they could do. The remaining poor souls trapped on the Orpheus were now completely on their own and in the hands of the most unforgiving of seas. When daylight finally broke, nothing could be seen of the ill-fated Orpheus but a stump of one of the masts and a few ribs. There were no more survivors. For many weeks the wreckage and bodies of sailors washed up along the Manukau Head's shoreline and on the beaches near Ninepin Rock. Many of the dead were buried not far from where they were found, with only the higher status individuals treated to formal burials. The body of Commodore Burnett was washed onto Waitakere Beach nearly 2 weeks after the disaster. He was buried at Symonds Street Cemetery in Auckland after a state funeral on the 23rd of February 1863. This is a photo of his grave taken not long after his death. Unfortunately, this grave is no longer there, as it was removed when a number of roads and bridges were thoughtfully ploughed right through the graveyard. There was an inquest into this disaster, and the two significant matters that came out of the inquest were: 1. The chart being used by the Orpheus was out of date, and 2. That 6 copies of the new regulations and signals for the new directions of the 21st of August 1861 had been forwarded to the senior officer of the Australia station in Sydney before HMS Orpheus had sailed for New Zealand, but for some unknown reason Orpheus had not received these new directions. If Orpheus had received these new directions, it would have been able to communicate with the pilot station correctly, and it would have known that the sandbar had shifted. The first chart of Manukau Harbour was prepared in 1853 on a survey carried out by Captain Drury in the surveying vessel Pandora. Now this was a later Pandora and not the famous mutiny on the Bounty Pandora. And this ship actually ran aground itself off Manukau Heads on the sandbanks in 1853 when it was surveying, but fortunately it was able to save itself. In 1861, so 2 years before the Orpheus set sail for New Zealand, the new survey ordered by the New Zealand government was carried out. From this survey, the new code of signals for the pilot station and revised directions for entering the harbour were officially published in the Government Gazette of the 21st of August 1861. Now, contained in these new directions that the Orpheus should have been supplied with was the following unmistakable warning. The outer south bank has worked northward 3/4 of a point in the bearing from Paratutai, and part of the north bank has cleared away since it was first surveyed by Captain Drury of HM surveying vessel Pandora in 1853. The directions for crossing the bar in that 1853 survey will lead over shallow and dangerous water. The course now to be steered is north-east by east, 3/4 east. The 9-pin rock full breadth open to the southward of the Paratutai. So in effect the bar and main channel has shifted north in the intervening 8 years between the two surveys. Orpheus was using an 1853 survey which did not contain the 1861 updated information, and Frederick Butler, the man whose eyes we looked through, was one of the survivors. He confirmed during the inquest that the 1853 chart was being used. So yes guys, the next time you are flying towards New Zealand and you are approaching Manukau Heads, just try and put yourself in the position of Frederick Butler, the young sailor who was locked in his small prison cell on the 7th of February of 1863, anxiously wondering what his fate was going to be once he was returned to HMS Harrier, the ship he had unlawfully deserted from just a few weeks earlier. And just try and think what was going through his mind when he looked out of his small porthole and he realised that the ship that he was currently locked within was on a direct course towards sandbanks that nobody else on the ship knew about. On the scale of frightening, this must surely be close to a 10. So thanks for watching Shipwrecks and Explorers. If you like this content, then please do give this channel a like and a subscribe. There are going to be many more videos like this coming up in the very near future. So Godspeed my friends, and I will see you all on the next one. Cheers for that.